Lagerkvist is asking these questions of us today. I mean, certainly in the 20th century, I think it's still viable today. You know, what compels some people either to have a faith and deny it, have a faith and support it, have a faith and be willing to die for it.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
Hello, let me begin by reading from the first paragraph of the book we're talking about today, Barabbas, by Pär Lagerkvist. Everyone knows how they hung there on the crosses, and who they were that stood gathered around him. Mary his mother, and Mary Magdalene, Veronica, Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea, who shrouded him. But a little further down this slope, rather to one side, a man was standing with his eyes riveted on the dying man in the middle, watching his death throes from the first moment to the last. His name was Barabbas. This book is about him. It's an amazing book, and to talk with me about this book is an amazing professor, June Ann Greeley, who is professor of literature and a bunch of other things, a medievalist from Sacred Heart University. June Ann, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Well, let's first talk about the man that wrote this. This is a novel. This is not a history book, although you sure feel like you're reading.
I agree.
It's a novel about Christ dying, and Barabbas, we all know, is the person who was saved from crucifixion, and you can talk a little about that, and Christ took his place.
Right.
So who is this author who is Swedish and won the Nobel Prize for Literature and has written many books? So go.
So Pär Lagerkvist is a very interesting author. He's probably one of those great unknowns in that he was celebrated for a long time in his own country, European countries. He wasn't really known in the United States until probably around the time he won the Nobel Prize in 1951. And he's in many ways a very typical Swedish boy. He was born around 1891. He grew up in a traditional Christian family, Lutheran family, not particularly observant, but grew up with the usual kinds of understandings of the Christian tradition, which I think feeds into some of the themes that we find in Barabbas. But he was always involved with writing and was always involved in ways in which that he could enter into the world of ideas. He had a lot of interest. He was particularly influenced by Expressionism and the Expressionist movement in the early 20th century. So the idea of using art as a means of expressing sort of deeper emotions, the idea of subjectivity, the idea of trying to see the world not in the grand scope, but looking through the singular lens of an individual, as we have here, was something that really appealed to him. But he was, as he continued to write and he continued his career, very clearly not a man of religion. As a matter of fact, at a certain point, he declared himself an atheist. I'm not sure if he was ever completely an atheist, but he was influenced by some of the German philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche among them, with whom I think he had a love affair, but also had a lot of tension. I think there are a lot of things about Nietzsche's thinking that was not particularly appealing to him. But the questions that religion raises, what is our purpose for being here? What is it to have faith? How do we live in a world in which, particularly I think after World War I and then World War II, how do we understand a world that moves in that direction and yet somehow claim there's a God? And I think all the big questions that arise from the world wars in the 20th century are ones that maybe we still have today, and that particularly, I think, engaged him. So that while at the end of the day, he himself was not a particularly religious individual, I think some of those some of the worries he had about a world in which perhaps we can say there's a God or there's a higher power, a distant God. About that, he wasn't sure. But he was also concerned, and I think this is what feeds into Barabbas' story a lot, a world in which the question of faith altogether, the question of belief, the question of being connected to something greater than ourselves, he was seeing slowly disappearing from first European, American culture. I think he was concerned about certainly European culture, European society, and that troubled him because that notion that perhaps there is a way in which we can all connect to each other, maybe find a way out of some of the messes we've made, was something that did drive him. And so Lagerkvist continued to write. He did write multiple books. Apart from Barabbas, probably the other most well-known one is a book called The Dwarf, which takes place in a Venetian Renaissance court where a character, the dwarf, is sort of plays kind of a Shakespearean fool, but again is sort of a representative of some of the negative aspects of human society, but raises a lot of the questions. Much as Barabbas, you could say, is sort of a negative character in some ways, but raises a lot of the questions that the modern and, quite frankly, postmodern world has to grapple with.
A good start. This man Barabbas, it's interesting because all of us who are Christian at any rate are sure aware of that name.
Sure.
Because he's the one that Pontius Pilate freed so that Jesus could be crucified. And you only think about that, and then you realize, well, this is history, and there was a real Barabbas, and whatever became of him.
Well, and
you don't even think about that,
exactly.
Of course, because Jesus is so omnipresent. But if you do think about it, you realize that, hey, that was a man, and what did he do? And that's really what this story is. And one would think, oh, well, he'd be instantly converted. But apparently, at least according to this story, maybe he wasn't. Backfill us there.
It has always fascinated me that Lagerkvist just chose this character Barabbas on which to, sort of create this conversation around what I think is a very, as I said, modern, postmodern question about faith and belief. And do we believe what we see? Do we even, we claim we can only believe it if we see it, but even then do we have that? And the character Barabbas himself is a rather murky character. We don't know a lot about him. We do know that he was what we would call a zealot. So he was at best somebody who we think would just historically, the context of the history of the time, was someone who wasn't necessarily religious. He wasn't necessarily part of the community of the Pharisees or any of the other religious groups, but he was an Israelite who was more interested in getting rid of Rome and pushing the Romans out of what was Palestinium at the time. And the whole idea of, prophets or messiahs were probably of less interest to him. So he's somebody who comes to the story without really a need or really a want for anything religious. And I think Lagerkvist captures that well, because he is completely, at the beginning of the story, the novel, he is completely befuddled. But why are people crying when this man's on the cross? Why are people so upset? Why is this woman, whom he later realizes is his mother, why is she so disturbed? I mean, he must have done something. And the whole idea that we in hindsight can say, but that was Jesus, so you've just been saved. Your life was forfeit and now it is no longer, wouldn't have even occurred to Barabbas at the time. And, I think that's probably true. I'm sure, we look at Jesus' story from the perspective of 2025 or whenever we're living, but at the time itself, did many people, even some of the apostles or disciples, did they really truly understand what was occurring and what was happening? So I think there's a humanity to Barabbas that I find very authentic. The idea that, there is this beautiful passage where at the beginning where he sees the man walking and he has a feeling about him. He doesn't quite know what to do with it. Barabbas is not an introspective man. Barabbas represents all of us who don't spend a lot of time reflecting or being self-aware. And there's a way in which he feels drawn to him, but he can't quite understand it, and he doesn't know what to make of it. And at the end of the day, maybe he'll just go back to the bar where his friends are hanging out and leave it at that. But of course, something is pulling at him, but he has no idea what it is. And that, I think, is closer to maybe those early days after Christ's death and then, his resurrection, then some ways that we tend to think of, well, everybody figured it out and everybody knew it was going to happen and it was all set. Yeah.
It's an amazing perspective, too.
Yeah,
It makes us think about all these complicated issues. Now, historically, of course, this is a novel, so this really didn't happen, but something happened. And Pär Lagerkvist winds up having Barabbas meet some historic figures. Do you want to talk about those visits?
Sure.
And then, go talk about those.
So I'll mention, at least I'll mention one or two, but I'll mention one in particular. So there's a lot of scenes, and again, it's done very deftly. It doesn't really sort of create a situation in which, and then Barabbas walks into, this room, and there's so-and-so.
It's a brilliant story.
He sort of leads, again, where I think it might have, something like that could have happened. Someone knows somebody, and he hears somebody talking, and he decides to go somewhere. So one of the characters he meets, and probably the most, bittersweet character is Lazarus. So there's a scene, I don't know if we have time to read it, but there's a scene where Barabbas is hurt. So he's been wondering about this man. Everybody's talking about it. His friends and his lady friends and all of the group at the bar really don't know or care about who this Christ was or what the crazy apostles were. We just knew he was a crazy preacher. So he's not really listening to them as much. But he does sort of run into some people who have a connection to either the disciples or Jesus himself or the apostles and so on. And through the course of meeting a couple of them, he hears about a man who's raised from the dead. And he doesn't even know what to make of that because he's trying to, put all of this together. And, when some of them sort of meet him, they aren't quite sure who he is either, but he's been asking questions. And so he eventually is brought to, and he meets this character we know as Lazarus. And what makes it such a poignant moment, and again, I think it's a very human encounter of the stories. We tend to see when we read scripture that the raising of Lazarus, apart from other theology and prefiguration, but the raising of Lazarus was a great, sign of Christ's power and God's, forgiveness, and this idea of raising from the dead, and it can happen, and we'll all be resurrected, and all these beautiful theological themes. But you never stop to think, what about Lazarus? I mean, what would it have been like to have been dead and then raised again? And did he want that to happen? And how, while people around him might have been happy, what was he really experiencing? I mean, in a real, truly honest sense. And so when Barabbas meets him, and again, it's not a very large scene, it's really only a couple of pages, he can't get over just how, I guess melancholy would be the best word. Melancholy this man is. He's not angry. He's not disturbed. He's kind of, he's a little emaciated. He doesn't look very healthy. We don't know how long he's going to live. But he doesn't seem to be quite as rapturous about his, being resurrected as some of the people who were talking about what Jesus had done were. And I think that, again, whether you're a believer or not, and I'm a practicing Catholic, but I mean, it is a very human moment. I mean, there is a sense when you want to say, I don't know, perhaps it's better to let him lie there in his sepulcher and let it sort of take its natural course. The other is, so he meets Lazarus, but then tied in with that a little later, he meets another very interesting character. So there's a group of men he's heard about, and he becomes Barabbas becomes very interested in them, almost a little fixated on them, because they seem to have, they're sort of a quiet group, and they seem to be very clubby with each other, and they don't seem to talk to a lot of outsiders, but they seem to have a language around this man whom Barabbas has since come to understand was put on the cross, and he did know the story, put on the cross so that Barabbas could live, so that Jesus was picked and Barabbas was let free, the Pilate let Barabbas free. So he notices in this group one man in particular, a big burly man with red hair, who seems to be just full of life and seems to be the leader of the group. And he wants to become a little closer to him. And so over the course, again, of just a few very simple pages, he sort of begins to ask the man, so who's your master and who are you following? What's this about? And Barabbas can't take any of it in. It's not even that he doesn't believe. He just doesn't know that he can believe or what it is to believe in that sort of miraculous stories. And of course, after a while, we begin to realize that that's Peter, the burly man with the red hair. And Peter and his friends, some of the other apostles, are very interested in this seemingly strange little man, or he's kind of a little guy, but very built, but this strange man who's been asking questions. And it's only in the course of a few bits of conversation they begin to realize, oh, you're Barabbas. And while they don't blame him for Christ's crucifixion, of course not. Barabbas had nothing to do with that in the sense that, that was the Romans, but the priestly group in the temple, but they see him as the one who survived while their Lord, was put on the cross. Because even Peter at that time, this is all before Easter, even Peter at that time wasn't quite sure about that resurrection on the third day, didn't quite believe himself. He sort of believed it, but couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. And at the point at which Barabbas meets them, and he first is introduced to Peter, they're all still in the throes of grief. And they're all still not sure if what Christ had said, Jesus had said about, I'll see you again, and the third day arise, and so on, if that was just sort of a metaphor, or, was it really meant, and how does it understood? And so when they see Barabbas and Peter realizes that Barabbas is who he is, they decide to shun him because somehow he represents the possibility that their Lord might have, that because he's alive, then their Lord is dead. And perhaps Barabbas somehow, they need to blame someone, so they sort of blame him. They sort of reject him. And that's when Barabbas begins to say, well, but you were talking about love and you were talking about, being kind, and now you're rejecting of me. So I'm not sure how this works. So those two characters in sort of a very quick moment. And again, I think there's a humanity to the stories that is very winning. When I've taught this book in class, I find that students really respond to that kind of honesty about what the real human experience of these 3 days, and then of course afterwards were.
Who do the students most relate to? For instance, I have this powerful feeling in biblical figures mentioned in the book with Lazarus. That he was kind of a thinker too,
right?
And what I'd call a wise man.
Right.
What about students? How do they relate to all these
I will tell you,
figures?
Seriously, a lot of the students connect with Barabbas in a really interesting way. They connect with him in that in the course of the novel, Barabbas seems to be, he doesn't even know this when he first begins, but he's really on a search. He's sort of on a spiritual quest, if you will. He's trying to make sense of his life because he doesn't really know, okay, so I was saved. I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do. He's long since left the Zealots. He's really not interested in politics anymore, or the fighting the Romans, because he eventually ends up in Rome, of course. But he's sort of wanting to believe in something. He wants to grab onto something. He's not like, my favorite character in the book is actually the little girl with the hair lip, because she just has this beautiful innocence about her, and she represents all of those sort of beautiful souls who listen to the message and sort of take in the revelation without question and absolutely believe in it and give themselves over to it. And no matter how she's treated, and she's treated horribly, she nevertheless still believes. And she, at the moment of, what might have been the resurrection, Barabbas isn't sure. He just saw a light, but he wasn't sure what it was. She absolutely kind of believes in it. And Barabbas is kind of, I think to some degree, is mystified by the strength of her belief later on when he meets his friend, when he's tied to his friend Sahak, who isn't even from that part of the world, and yet believes the stories and is willing to do anything anything for his faith. Barabbas doesn't understand that kind of commitment, that kind of love, that kind of adoration and reverence. And I think in the course of the novel, he's looking for something. I'm not sure at the end he ever really achieves it, but he's on this journey. And I would have to say that, I would say all my students, but a good number of them identify at least with this question of a spiritual quest. There's something missing in life. They're not quite sure what it is. So I'm talking now about students who don't necessarily have a religious background, or they might have had a religious background and since left it, but they understand Barabbas trying to make sense of what at the end of the day isn't really a question of the mind as much as of the heart, and isn't really something that, faith isn't something that we can manufacture. Augustine talks about the idea that it's just going to exist. And it takes some people a long time to sort of have that present. Other people just sort of have that faithful heart from the beginning. And I think that my students understand Barabbas trying in different ways, using his head a lot, trying to figure out the stories, trying to make sense of it. It doesn't quite gel, but he wants to feel that connection and admiring those people who they're not foolish. They just have a purity of faith that has escaped him. And I think they make a connection to that. I mean, there are other characters too with whom they identify, but it's interesting the number of students who've looked at Barabbas and said, I get that journey.
It's interesting, Junan, that you say that because, and in some ways, for those who have not yet read this book, and this is an easy read, wonderful read, and it's a short book,
right?
Is that you make Barabbas seem, I think, a little bit nicer and better as a human being than he really is. Barabbas is a bad guy,
right?
I mean, he was on that cross for a reason. I mean, he, I guess, was a murderer. He was a criminal. He was all those bad things. So when he gets off by circumstance that he wasn't even familiar with, he's suddenly back to the old stuff. Who can I kill? What can I steal? So it turns out though that all these other things are moving in the society at the time, including one of the most profound thing in history, Jesus.
Right.
So there he was, a bad guy, kind of all of a sudden against the best person.
Right.
And his followers. How do all those things happen? And then he winds up getting chased out of Jerusalem.
Right.
And then he winds up in another prison. Actually a mine prison. So walk us through some of that stuff.
Sure. So Barabbas is, he is, especially immediately after his salvation and the first, while after that, he kind of gets back to his old ways, and yet, again, I see him as still kind of bemused by some of the things that he's hearing. I think the language of the hair lip girl, when she keeps saying, the message that you need to know is love one another. He doesn't even know what love is. He's clearly somebody who's never known love in his life, never known kindness. He himself has never been kind, nor has he known kindness. As a matter of fact, there's implications that he had a very torturous childhood. And so he lives a life that, he still is going to get involved with a little bit of theft. He's going to get involved in a little bit of the same activities. And we don't really see a lot of him in terms of, it's almost like Jesus' story. There's a whole lacuna there where suddenly he ends up in a mine tied to what will be his friend Sahak. And as you said, the mine is in the ground. He's going to be there. And the implication is historically is that to be in that kind of service, to be imprisoned, to be, first of all, having been captured and convicted of something and having been imprisoned in that kind of condition means that he must have done some things that were really reprehensible. And yet he happens to be tied in with somebody, Sahak, who, technically speaking, seems to be just this lovely man, who believes in Jesus. I mean, there's also a backstory there, but his journey to that mine is, again, it has kind of the motif of going into the underground and going below. And Sahak begins to talk to him and kind of explain to him his belief. And
these are two people that are tied together.
They're literally chained together. But the Romans would do this as, it
harder to escape.
Yeah, how to escape was a horrific form of punishment, and you were literally tied at the ankles, and so you would never be released. And so it was the implication is that they had done some horrific things. Now remember, though, speaking of someone who has a little background in history, it's hard to know what upset the Romans. It could have been they just didn't say something nice about Caesar. Mm-hmm. So it could have been that, and Sahak certainly as a Christian, or at least someone following a Jewish Christian, someone who was following that teaching, that might have been enough because you were beginning to see just not the persecutions yet, but certainly there was the beginning of a resentment towards that group. So that Barabbas is going to spend a good deal of time there, and it's only, and it's through his time with Sahak that he finds himself while they're in the mines, and he's stunned by he's stunned by the fact that here's a man who's chained to him. They're in the mines. They have to work in this horrific conditions. They're beaten. They have these horrific guards. They're made fun of. They're tortured. And yet Sahak still believes. And for Barabbas, and I think this is why when I mentioned the fact that this comes out just after World War II, I think after 2 World Wars, Lagerkvist was asking a question that a lot of people were asking, at the time. How can we believe in a God and a just God after what we just saw happening? And yes, human free will and all of that, but nevertheless, the kinds of destruction and the kinds of desecration we saw, and yet people still believe. And that, I think, was Lagerkvist's own question. I mean, in a way, Lagerkvist maybe is a little bit of Barabbas too, because there's a scene where, Barabbas is just, the way it's described, he's listening to Sahak talk about, oh, you knew him, you were there, you knew Jesus, or you knew my master. And Barabbas is like, yeah, I don't know what to really tell you about him because I didn't follow him. And then Sahak has this just almost look in his face, and he's just sort of enraptured with the idea. And, he talks about loving one another, again, from the same as the girl with the hair lip. And Barabbas just can't wrap his head around that, just doesn't understand how we can believe while yet we're living in these horrific conditions. And so eventually they're going to be real. This is probably the worst part of the story, is when eventually, I don't know how much deeper we can go into, but they're going to be allowed to come above ground, after a certain point. And one of the things that Sahak had done is he has a medallion, and the medallion is the medallion that indicates he's a slave of Rome. Barabbas has one too. But on the other side of the medallion, he writes some words to indicate that he's also a slave of Jesus, that he's a servant of Jesus, and that he's going to be a follower of Jesus. And Barabbas doesn't quite know why Sahak did that, but he said, I think I want to have that too. Is that how we become faithful? Is that what we do? Do we put words on things? Do we get amulets? Is there something magical about that? He has no real sort of religious understanding. And unfortunately, after a certain number of a period of time, one of the guards reveals to the head guard that these 2 men, and he points particularly to Sahak, has this medallion, and they've defaced the medallion because he has the words Jesus on the other side of it. And again, the long story short is that there's a time in which Barabbas either could have, and so Sahak is brought before, Sahak and Barabbas are brought before the head of the soldiers there. And he's been given a chance to deny Jesus, and that was kind of the earliest stages of the Jewish Christians, to deny their faith, and take the medallion and crush it, or suffer the penalty.
And the penalty is death.
And the penalty is death. And so Sahak refuses to do so. And at a time when he sort of looks at Barabbas, thinking that after all we've talked about, after all we've been through, isn't it possible that you could do this with me? And this is where maybe the underbelly of Barabbas comes up. He doesn't.
No.
And he allows his friend to be put to death. And there's a scene, and it's somewhat similar to the beginning, in that Barabbas is off by the side, and he's kind of hiding as his friend is led to his death, and he does nothing and he says nothing. And while he has some guilt over that, it's also, I'm not making excuses for him, just to say that in a very human way, he doesn't understand why Sahak didn't save his own life. Like why didn't he just
it'd be
deny
real easy
Christ?
to deny Christ.
Just deny Christ. Who cares? It doesn't matter, and you would have been alive. And so the fact that there is both the girl with the hair lip and now Sahak, these 2 individuals who were willing to die for a belief, and so again, I think this is where Lagerkvist is asking these questions of us today. Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly in the 20th century, I think it's still viable today. What compels some people either to have a faith and deny it, have a faith and support it, have a faith and be willing to die for it. And Barabbas never quite understands why Sahak did what he did. He very much understands, I'm not dying for anybody. This is not anything that I would die for. And the sense that, while the first time he saw a man be put to death, Jesus be put to death, he didn't quite understand what was going on, didn't understand any of the story. This is something he's really immersed in. And knowing that he could have either died with him, or maybe found a way to help Sahak change his mind, or maybe even lie and say, oh, these weren't ours, we found them, or figure out some way to help him. He did nothing except let Sahak, because Sahak wouldn't lie. and let Sahak die, this horrific death. So,
by the way, too, I should at least mention that this woman with the hair lip was probably a prostitute. I mean, she wasn't the cleanest lady in town. On the other hand, that really wasn't all that terrible back then, because that's the only way you could make a living. And but she really had this deep and profound faith and was an amazingly fine human being.
And I think that's the Christian message.
Yes.
I mean, in a way, the fact that she was possibly a prostitute. I mean, she was, not. She wasn't as rowdy as some of the others.
And she took care of him.
Exactly. And this idea that Jesus came for sinners. Jesus sat with tax collectors and prostitutes. Let he who was without sin cast the first stone. Jesus was without condemnation. Jesus was without judgment. Jesus loved. And I think that I think it's a brilliant moment in the story that of all the characters Lagerkvist could have had Barabbas connect to, I mean, I think in terms of really understanding Jesus's message, the girl with the hair lip, even more than Peter, really truly understood, as did Sahak, the depth of what what love truly means, what this love that Christ and sacrifice means, the love that Christ showed for us, what she was willing to give up. And, when she's waiting for the resurrection and Barabbas is kind of with her out in the desert, they're out by where the tomb is. And he's kind of, again, he's always in the background. He very rarely, if you read the story, he's never really front and center. He's always to the side or a little bit to the background or hiding something. He really can't bring himself to the center. But all he sort of chalks it up as, he says, well, I don't know. I closed my eyes. Something happened. I don't know. I don't know what it was. Whereas the girl with the hair lip, as is described by the narrator, is just sort of lost in sort of a light. It doesn't even really go into the description, lost in light, but absolutely believes that she has witnessed the resurrection. Barabbas, who is there with her, a little bit to the side, but in the back, but still with her, refuses to accept that it was anything that, I don't know, I closed my eyes, or I'm not sure what I saw. It probably wasn't anything. And so again, that idea of, this idea of, do we construct our own faith life in that I'm only going to believe what I want to believe and it makes sense to me? Are we willing to open ourselves up to the possibility of the mystery and that some things can happen over which we have no real understanding, but they still exist and are true? Do we truly have to go through a theology in order to, accept the truth of an event? And for that one scene with a little girl with her hair lip and, she lives on the dung heap and she's a forgotten individual in the world. And this is the person who witnesses the resurrection. I mean, there could be others, but in this one, novel, this is who witnessed the resurrection. To me, that's the perfect Christian message. In a sense, I think she embodies the Christ's message of love almost perfectly in the story.
I want to do a little bit of a spoiler.
Oh, yes, of course.
But not a real spoiler.
That's okay.
Let's move now all the way to the end of this 150-page book.
Okay.
Barabbas winds up where?
In Rome.
And on what? On the cross.
On the cross.
Again.
It's a very compelling ending, isn't it? And it's very ambiguous. And you know how we English teachers love ambiguity, right? We do like the ambiguity.
We certainly have that here.
And, it's, I think it's also, again, Lagerkvist mining some understanding of what faith is. So we have Barabbas. He's much older now. He's long since left the mines. He's in Rome. He's actually working for one of the soldiers, the elite soldiers who are in the mines. He's living in Rome. And he's hearing again about the Christian, or, these followers of Jesus, and the names are starting to remind him. And again, it's a spoiler alert for anyone out there, but long story short, there's a point at which he notices that there are, and he runs again into some of the characters he had met before, including Peter, who are older now and are in a situation that, is bringing him to his death. But he is part of what seems to be a Christian rebellion. He thinks that the Christians are setting fire to Rome. He thinks that's of course, the propaganda that the Romans are putting forth. The Roman imperial family is putting forth. He thinks that that's what he has to do to join with his old friends, that if he sets fire to Rome, maybe that will bring him into, an understanding. He's met with them a couple of times in the catacombs. He's still trying to figure them out. He's so old now that it's much later in the day, but he still is kind of on a quest. And so he becomes involved in this brouhaha. Now, of course, the Christians had nothing to do with the burning of Rome. That was just an excuse for Nero to burn Rome. So he eventually is caught and is captured. And this is, again, a time when he was confronted with, are you a Christian? Are you a follower of this Jesus? And he said no when his friend Sahak died. This is a time when he accepts his situation. And so at the very end, he's let out because the Romans used crucifixion as their form of capital punishment, so it wasn't that unusual. But at the very end, he's let out, and he is walking alone. So there are others there with him who are walking to be crucified for crimes against Rome. That was always kind of their form. And there's just this incredibly doleful scene at the very end where Barabbas is being crucified. He's alone. And at the very, very end, I can just read at the very end, it says, only Barabbas was left hanging there alone, still alive. When he felt death approaching, that which he had always been so afraid of, he set out into the darkness as though he were speaking to it, to thee I deliver up my soul. And then he gave up the ghost. So did Barabbas finally find his faith? Did he finally come to a recognition and an understanding of what Christ had done and what he was doing? Did he finally sort of find his wholeness, find his soul, his spirit? It's unclear because he says those words. Does he truly know what they mean? He knows that that's the words that Jesus had said, and he's heard it before. But Barabbas has seemed to be, over time, a mimic. He seems to mimic people. So if the girl the helper says, love one another, Barabbas says, okay, love one another. If Sahak says, we'll have this on a medallion, okay, I'll do that too. He seems to sort of want to copy people without any kind of interior understanding. And at the end, does he truly, truly come to understand what it means to say, to thee I give up my spirit, what his spirit is, to whom he's giving it up to, and all that? It's unclear. We'd like to think he does, and a lot of people have. A lot of my students did when we've taught this book. But some have said, I don't know. Not sure.
Well, she's pretty amazing. Junan Greeley, who is one of the many great professors here at Sacred Heart University. This is really great.
Yes.
This book, Barabbas, a good read anytime, but especially around the Easter season.
Yeah.
It's an easy, powerful read that makes you think, and look how it made Junan and me even think, which is pretty hard to make me think. So thank you for watching. We hope you take advantage of some of the great literature of this kind that we present to you on this video podcast, and we hope to see you again.